All right, we're going to look at Milton's two unique poems, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, today. These are works that are rather unique in English literature, insofar as they seem to represent opposite possibilities for the individual life, and they really are foils for one another, presented as opposite sides of one coin. I am going to give you a brief literary history of the poems and the possibilities of the sources that Milton is drawing on. Remember, as extraordinary as Milton is in his use of poetic form, and as we noted from the outset, Milton seemed to be wanting in his endeavors to be mastering form from his early days, preparing himself for the grand poem that he believed that God had called him to write, which he ended up doing in the end, Paradise Lost. But it took a long time for him to get there. And along the way, he wrote some really fantastic poems in their own light, and for which he would be regarded as a great poet if he had not written his major works at the end of his days. But we're going to look at two of these here, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, as I say. This idea of opposite possibilities, it's not that it's unprecedented, and certainly we can see, so I'm a Romantic scholar, we can see it in Blake to some degree in his Songs of Innocence and Experience. These are two contrary states for the soul, as Blake presents it. You can see something similar in the poetry of Milton's contemporary, Andrew Marvell, and friend, who interceded for him when the knives were out for Milton after the Charles II came back from France. Milton was placed under house arrest instead of being executed, as was discussed at the time. And in Marvell's work, there's two poems I have in mind in particular, and I'm not going to go into them. There's one, a dialogue between the resolved soul and created pleasure, and the one I know better, dialogue between soul and body. And these present a debate of contraries, as it were. So this idea of a contradiction or opposition is not only fairly commonplace in poetry, but in a sense it does play upon something of the way poetry actually works. Poetry, you remember, can use literal language for its depictions, but by and large, what distinguishes poetry, not absolutely, but in its predominance, is the use of figurative language, and figures are a sort of contradiction. One thing suggests another, and hence we use things like metaphors and similes and so forth. And there is an element of tension there, and those who don't like tension or this sense of ambiguity dislike poetic language for that reason. So that sense of contradiction is part of the meat and drink of the poet to begin with. But that's a matter of the of art in general. I don't think Milton is commenting on that here per se. It's just simply an observation that using contraries in order to make points is really what poets often do, and particularly excel in. So they use the principle of repetition and variation. These are the two artistic principles I think we can see certainly in poetry. But Milton is talking here about two individuals, two types, as it were. And in doing this, as I said, he is drawing upon a tradition of explorations of character. Now, these have an ancient vintage. They go back, to my knowledge, to the Greek writer Theophrastus. Now, Theophrastus was originally one of Plato's pupils, and after Plato had died, he attached himself to Aristotle, the Lyceum. And when Aristotle had to flee Athens, Theophrastus took over as the head of the school, and he wrote wrote a work called On Moral Characters. And so Theophrastus is the earliest, or at least the most famous exponent of character studies, and he was very interested in the moral features of character. And the differences that we note among people, which in our day and age is commonly associated with the discipline of psychology. People explain character types in terms of not of character, but rather of I don't even know how the psychologists, personality types. All of these things are these terms beg questions. What do we mean? What's the difference between a personality and a character? What's the difference between the use of psyche as it's used by modern psychologists as opposed to how it's used in ancient languages, for instance? And there is much to be questioned there. So these are, when we are trying to be scientific and precise, we run into the challenge of definitions, because there's no science or knowledge without clarity of definitions. But I've talked about this on numerous occasions, questioning the exact precision and scientific basis of many of the modern social sciences on the basis of their claim to be progressive and superior in their discipline to those of the ancient arts. And it tends to relate exactly to this matter of definitions. But let me now not go into that further. But so Theophrastus' characters is study on moral characters is an early precedent for this. Another might be Plutarch's parallel lives. So Plutarch was a writer in the Roman era, writing in Greek, comparing and contrasting great Greek figures with great Roman figures. So when he looked at orators, famous orators, he compared and contrasted Demosthenes, the great Greek orator, with Cicero, for instance. And likewise, and I think he wrote something in the order of 36 of these. I could be in error about the number, but this study in contrast of characters. But that wasn't so much a study in character. It was a study in position and gifting and so forth, not quite so nearly associated with character. A far more close approximation to what Milton is doing here is one of his Milton's contemporaries, Robert Burton, who wrote a work that was wildly popular in Milton's day, called The Anatomy of Melancholy. And it was published in 1621, so certainly when Milton was a young man, and it was republished 5 times over 17 years. So it was presented as and that book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, was presented as a medical textbook, but he was dealing with the issue of melancholia, which one of the features of which is now what we currently associate with clinical depression. But it's when I say it's a medical textbook, as is usual in the day, it has far richer and broader ambit than simply what we would consider a medical textbook. So it talks about philosophical issues and theological issues, and he draws this out in order to look at emotion and so forth. So this is very interesting, and it's very encyclopedic in its scope. Milton is doing something similar here in L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, except he's not diagnosing melancholy. He is juxtaposing 2 lives, that of the cheerful man, or the happy man, l'allegro, with the melancholic man, or the contemplative man, il penseroso. And in so doing, and the contrast could not be starker in Milton's presentation of this, I think we can see something of what I've mentioned elsewhere as the contrast between two types of vocations, as Aristotle would have seen it. On the one hand, we have the bios politicus, the political life, the active life, what the ancient world called the vita activa. And on the other hand, the bios theoreticus, or the vita contemplativa. And so, and the contemplative life and the theoretical life is that of the mind, and it's been commonly associated and much lampooned as well, that those who are of the intellectual disposition are often melancholic, prone to depression, and so forth. Whereas those who are in active service, in military service, in the political life, and are often exuberant, cheerful, and so forth. This is sort of a fixed character trait of those who inhabit those forms of life. And if you read Shakespeare's works, he often portrays the contemplatives in such terms, that is, melancholic, brooding, depressive, and so forth, whereas he will portray the political active agents in life as cheerful and exuberant and rash, and so forth. So Milton's not just plucking this from nowhere. He's drawing upon a long-standing tradition of noting features and character traits of certain personality types there. What I want to discuss here now is exactly getting into the specific features of the poems, and I will pause here for a moment and address that in the next segment. Thank you.